understanding how horses shaped the world that we live in now is actually really important to figuring out where we're going next.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Potker. Horses first evolved in North America, but native populations died off during the ice ages of the Pleistocene era. Since the 16th century, when Spanish colonists reintroduced horses to North America, they have played dramatic roles in the shaping of the West. But the European history and the indigenous peoples' records have not always aligned. Our guest today, William Taylor, assistant professor and curator of archaeology at the University of Colorado Boulder, is rethinking the story of the horse in the American West. Dr. Taylor, how did you first become interested in studying horses?
My interest in the study of horses actually, I was raised in Montana, and my grandfather was a rancher. My father grew up on a ranch, and then I'm kind of that first generation of folks that didn't directly grow up working with horses. And so as I've kind of grown into my scholarship as an archaeologist, I've always been fascinated by horses and horse culture. I first sort of learned how to do archaeology kind of by accident in Mongolia, which is one of the world's greatest horse cultures. And I didn't really intend to end up working on a project in Mongolia with the Smithsonian, but that's where I was. And the first thing that I was able to do there was to work on excavation of a 2,500-year-old horse burial. And in doing so, I was working alongside Mongolian scholars and archaeologists who were kind of still cowboys themselves. And so I realized there that we had a natural bond because of my background in Montana, my family's history. I always really wanted to bring that back to this part of the world, the Great Plains and the Rockies, because this is home for me. And so that human horse story is part of what built this part of the world.
How are horses important to our understanding of history?
Horses are deeply, deeply connected, both the logistics of the world that we live in today, as well as sort of at the root of identity, politics, ecology across the American West. You know, in Colorado here, every street that you drive down, you'll see a horse popping up in sort of contemporary culture. You know, we had the Denver Broncos, or when you land at the airport here, right, you see this ferocious blue Mustang. But in fact, understanding how horses shaped the world that we live in now is actually really important to figuring out where we're going next. And for many indigenous folks in the West, horses are actually a tremendous symbol of, you know, sovereignty, autonomy. They're connected in with ceremonial and spiritual practices, identity, healing. And so being able to recognize the antiquity of that relationship is part of the future, right? It's part of protecting the animals, traditional breeds that are still curated and stewarded today. It's part of, you know, restoring the narrative there about what happened over the last 500 years and what role did horses play? What do they mean for the future?
What were you able to discover in this study?
So in this study, we analyzed archaeological collections from across the Southwest and Western United States. And we were hoping to use our kind of interdisciplinary scientific study of these archaeological horse remains to explore when, where, and how domestic horses were first integrated into indigenous societies across, you know, the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. And through our application of osteological analysis alongside biomolecular techniques like stable isotope analysis, genomic sequencing, and radiocarbon dating, and considering these new lines of evidence alongside things like archaeological context, as well as indigenous oral traditions and perspectives on the horse, we discovered that across much of horse country of the Western United States, there's scientific evidence that horses were integrated into indigenous societies long before the first arrival of European colonists or settlers, and before that relationship would have been documented in historic records coming out of that context. So our results show that from as far away from Idaho through places like Wyoming, Kansas, down into New Mexico, right, that by at least the turn of the 17th century, the early 1600s, that domestic horses were already being deeply integrated into indigenous societies. This means not just that horses were present, but that they were being raised or receiving veterinary care or being ridden or integrated into economic systems like being fed corn in one instance. And that while our research showed these horses were ultimately of Iberian ancestry, right? Spanish likely ancestry, they must have in many areas here actually reached their integration into indigenous societies through other networks, perhaps indigenous networks of trade and exchange, rather than through the direct, connection with European folks.
That certainly has some implications beyond what I learned in school. Can you tell us a little bit about how important this discovery is?
So I think this discovery prompts us to sort of rethink many important aspects of that human horse story. It teaches us that there's greater antiquity to the story of native folks and horses than we previously thought. It also tells us that it's important to do good science. We have to be working directly with indigenous folks, right? It shows us that there are pieces of important scientific wisdom encoded in aspects of oral tradition. And to do a good job, we have to do collaborative science.
You mentioned collaborative science there. Can you tell us about some of the indigenous groups that have contributed to this work?
For this project, we work with a number of folks. Our archaeological materials from the Central Plains and the Southwest, we worked with a couple groups that are directly linked with those. We have Pawnee scholars and archaeologists here at CU. We worked with Pueblo folks. We worked with Comanche folks. And those are folks that are directly linked to the kind of archaeological materials that we study. We also, though, partnered with, especially for our genomic study, partnered with a team of Lakota scientists and elders who have been working to sort of rescue, care for, and steward traditional indigenous horse breeds from across, not just their own, but from across the Western United States. We partnered closely with especially a team of Oglala scholars and elders to try to connect up Lakota perspectives on horses, oral traditions, and that human-horse relationship in the plains.
What sort of breeds were you finding?
Breed is an interesting word. The ancient horses probably didn't follow the same sort of concept that we would use today about, what is or isn't a breed. One thing we would like to do with our future work, as we're sort of building out these genetic data sets of, early domestic horses in the Great Plains and across the American West, is understand the kind of innovations and changes to horse raising that were brought about by native folks. So there are certain things, for example, unique color patterns, the Appaloosa and paint horses. There are different relationships between people and horses across the plains that probably did manifest in some interesting ways at a genetic level. I would say this project is probably a starting point that might allow us to explore those kind of questions in the future, kind of in partnership with native folks.
How are you getting stories from the archaeologic record?
Even just a single bone of a horse is this incredible chronicle of all the different aspects of what happened to that horse when it was alive. And it sort of encodes a lot of sort of clues to those relationship of ancient horses with people. I'll just give a couple of examples. One horse, early horse from southern Wyoming here, it was a baby horse, and isotope analysis suggested to us that horse was sort of born and died in the area of southwestern Wyoming that it was found. That horse received an injury, and the osteological study of that horse suggests that the animal was cared for before it died, and that when it died, archaeological context shows us that it was integrated into, indigenous ceremonial practices. So it was buried alongside with 3 coyote skulls. Another horse that we looked at, an adult male horse from Kansas, showed us evidence that it was bridled and ridden. And isotopic study of that horse actually tells us that it was likely fed corn, maize, an indigenous domestic plant crop, to get through a tough winter. So those are some examples of the various sort of multiplicity of different economic or cultural aspects of that human horse story that are showing up still preserved in the archaeological record. Nowadays, with this incredible, innovation in biomolecular science. Even just a little bit of unidentifiable bone might give us genomic information about the lineage of that horse, its traits, phenotypic traits, its relationship to other horses. And in some cases, right, if you have a tooth, isotope study could tell us all sorts of things about where that horse lived during certain parts of its life, how it moved, what kinds of sort of water and dietary sources it consumed. And so when you look at all this together, even just a single bone can tell us an extraordinary wealth of information.
What was the biggest surprise for you?
I was really surprised to learn just how much information and knowledge can be encoded in stories, traditions, and even language. So, we have our Comanche partner, Jimmy Arterbury, in our paper. He actually brought forth some of the Comanche language as it pertains to words, different words for the horse, and how they actually encode different parts of the story of, first encountering horses as a transport animal, and then, raising horses and having words for a young horse, a baby horse, and the incredible depth of information that's actually built there into those stories and even the words themselves. And that's not something I'm familiar with as a white guy from Montana. I'm not familiar with that level of information and nuance about my own understanding of the past, even though I might have grown up in this part of the world.
What's the next step?
A lot of things are next. We're hoping to build from this project. So we're continuing to work on questions of that earliest relationship of people and horses, the Ice Age, Pleistocene, early Holocene, potentially that side of things archaeologically. We also want to try to apply this model to understanding the past in other areas of the world. So we're working now with some scholars from Argentina, for example, on whether archaeology, interdisciplinary archaeology, might reorient what we know about the spread of horses into the Pampas and Patagonia and, the Southern Cone. So those are some little aspects of the work that we hope to build going forward. But we also hope to continue our partnership with tribes, so we're working with the Lakota folks and this Global Institute for Traditional Sciences to find new ways that different kinds of archaeology can connect in with indigenous perspectives and help us ask new questions that are kind of driven by indigenous communities.
Finally, what do you hope is the impact of this work? What would you want people to take away from it?
So I hope that this study encourages folks to reframe the way that they think about people and horses in the West, to understand that for many indigenous communities in this part of the world, that relationship with horses is significantly older, and it's kind of organically personal, right, between native folks and horses, rather than some kind of a symptom of European colonization. That relationship is old, and it's important, and it's a source of kind of power, autonomy, sovereignty. And it means, that we were wrong from taking a perspective that was derived only from a kind of a European historical lens. So I think it would prompt us to work closer with indigenous communities when we're doing science, to question the assumptions that might be caked into, especially historical narratives, and the power of kind of interdisciplinary archaeology to do better science and to get us closer to the truth when it's done collaboratively.
Special thanks to William Taylor and Dina Headley. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Potker. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.